Larry Summers is here. He's President Emeritus of Harvard University. He served as Treasury Secretary under President Clinton and as Director of President Obama's National Economic Council. Last week, the ECB said it would buy more than $1 trillion of assets to boost inflation in Europe that had been struggling for years with a debt crisis. On Wednesday, the Federal Reserve signaled that it would not raise short-term interest rates any earlier than June. I am pleased to have Larry Summers back at this table. Welcome.
Good to be with you, Charlie.
So you were at Davos. I was at Davos. You were on panels. I did a couple of interviews. What was the sense of all these politicians and business people and academicians and NGOs about the economy and about the state of the world? Because the theme was said to be the context.
Charlie, it was something intermediate. It certainly wasn't euphoric, but it certainly wasn't as dark as it was in 2009 or 2010 at the height of the financial crisis. I think there is a growing concern about a deflationary psychology, a sense of stagnation, of very, very almost pathologically low interest rates taking hold in many, many places. So there was an undertow of concern. I think people admired enormously what Mario Draghi did,
right,
but they admired it more than they were confident that it would be sufficient to solve Europe's very profound problems. And
As I understand, that's your position too.
That's my that is what I believe. I think people were also not 100% certain about any place outside of the United States, and they weren't 100% certain about the U.S. growth prospect, though they felt better about that
than
they did any other place. But I guess they asked the same question that, ironically, I asked during the time I was Treasury Secretary in the 90s. How long can the world economy continue to fly on a single American engine? Yeah. And the answer, when I asked it, was it didn't end up flying that much longer. We headed into recession in 2000 and 2001, and we have to be mindful of that. I think we are in uncharted territory economically.
Driven by the lack of demand,
driven
the lack
by
of
the
growth,
problem today is the lack of demand, not the lack of supply. The problem today is that inflation is too low, not that inflation is too high. The problem today is not that central banks are being too activist. It's that they may have trouble being activist enough. The problem today is that there's too much savings and too little spending, right, too little investment. So it's a very different world than we're used to.
Give us an economic professor's understanding of the threat of inflation and deflation, or the lack of inflation.
The usual view, and what would have been most of what we would have taught our students till a few years ago, would have been about inflation, Charlie, and it would have been that when prices were rising rapidly, it was harder to keep track of things, that interest rates were much higher, and because interest rates were much higher, people wasted a lot of effort making sure that they had funds earning interest and the like, that just like it really wouldn't do for a yard to be 36 inches long one year and 38 inches the next, having the price level rising at a rapid and changing rate just made it much harder for anybody to think and plan. And so we were best off avoiding inflation, and that if we just committed and were credible and strong against inflation, that we could avoid it, that the problem, there was really no good that came of inflation, but that it was always tempting because in the short run you could goose the economy a bit with inflation, but then it all caught up with you.
But that's not the opinion today?
That people would still feel that way about inflation. About if we had the problem of potentially high inflation, they would still have that view. But we're in a different world. The whole institution of independent central banks and all of that was conceived to prevent too much inflation. Today, our problem is that we don't have enough inflation. You know, you can look by looking at what are called indexed bonds, bonds that are linked to the CPI. You can get a market measure of expected inflation. And if you look at Europe, you look at Japan, or you look at the United States, inflation is expected to be below the 2% target, not just right now, not just a couple of years from now, but between 2020 and 2025. So the problem is that we've got inflation at too low a level. And because we've got inflation at too low a level, and because in Europe and in Japan, deflation is still a continuing issue.
And what's deflation?
Deflation is when prices are falling.
Right.
And there's another thing which you might call lowflation, which is when inflation, when prices are rising, but they're rising slower than the 2% a year. That's what most people have set as an objective.
When we talk about the price of things, we're talking about markets for commodities. We're talking about financial markets. We're talking about the price of price of products and wages.
When economists or in these contexts talk about inflation, they're talking about the price of everything people buy. So it's the price of a dining room table, it's the price of a shirt,
food. It's
the price of a food, but it's also the price of taking the bus, right. the price of taking a vacation, the fees associated with getting a bank account, the fees associated with sending your kid to college or going to the hospital. But it's not the price of buying a stock, because that's different, and it's not the wage rate. It's the generalized price level.
And the price of commodities affects what you buy.
The price of commodities is obviously a very important input to that. But when you have a situation where prices are falling, then people say to themselves, why should I buy something now? It's going to be cheaper next year. Yeah. And so you get a negative psychology where people don't spend because they think things are going to be cheaper next year. And because they don't spend, there's enormous pressure to reduce prices. And the more prices are being reduced, the more people don't spend. And you get a negative kind of psychology, and it can be a kind of trap that an economy can fall in. Related in terms of the costs of deflation, in any economy, there's some people who borrow money, and there's some people who lend money. It tends to be richer people who lend money and poorer people who borrow money. It tends to be people who are more in need who borrow money. When prices are falling, or when there isn't the inflation that was expected, then what happens is the borrowers are getting poorer because they're having to pay in more valuable dollars than they expected, and the creditors are getting richer. Well, that also operates to reduce spending and cause economic contraction. It also operates to be taking from people who are more in need and giving to people who are less in need. It also makes bankruptcies more likely because it's easier to pay back in dollars that are getting less and less valuable than in dollars that are getting more and more valuable. That's why these phenomena of deflation and lowflation are so potentially toxic, and they don't just make the economy function a little less well, they run the risk of creating a situation where there isn't enough spending and there isn't enough demand and there are too many problems in finance for the economy to be able to employ everybody or produce as much as it could. Right. And that's what we've seen for years now.
All right, I want to get to a number of things. You and Ed Balls were at the Center for American Progress, I think, and talked about inclusive prosperity committee or commission or something like that. Commission, was it?
Commission, yes.
And the conclusion was sustained increases in wages and living standards are essential.
That's right.
And how do we get that?
We were convened by Neera Tanden and the Center for American Progress to think about progressive agendas to address common challenges like globalization, like technology, that are applying not just in the United States, but are applying around the world. And it was an effort to build on the kind of discussions that had taken place globally in the 1990s under the auspices of President Clinton and then British Prime Minister Tony Blair. I think the biggest difference between then and now is the centrality of inequality as something that is affecting the middle class and affecting the prospects for middle class growth. Think about this. If the income distribution in the United States were the same as it was in 1979, there would be $1 trillion more in the hands of the lower 80%. $1 trillion, or $11,000 per family, in the hands of the bottom 80% of the population. And there'd be $1 trillion less in the hands of the top 1%. Largely in the top 1%. The other 19% isn't changed very much. And that would be $750,000 less on average per family for them. So there's been a big redistribution that has worked to the detriment of the middle class. And unfortunately, at the same time, we've made that worse for the middle class with a set of changes that have come in. We have less progressive taxation than we did then. We're investing much less in the public sector than we did then. We have much less in the way of protections that strengthen worker rights as we move to a kind of TaskRabbit economy where people just get hired for a few hours without benefits to perform tasks, and where the union movement has not been supported as strongly as it could have been. So there have been a variety of changes that go beyond the financial crisis that have exacerbated the inequality and exacerbated the lack of growth, and that's what we call for. We stress, and this is really an important point because I think that some people tend to be fatalistic about this, and I think that's really very wrong. That there are countries, Canada and Australia are two good examples, that by focusing on these basic investments, by empowering workers, by strengthening education, have succeeded, by healthy regulatory and other mechanisms, have succeeded in having rising standards of living for the middle class in a way that we or the Great Britain have been much less successful.
So what should we do, copy what they did?
We shouldn't copy. Every country has to pursue its own approach. We lay out a comprehensive agenda. I've mentioned some of the things. Public investment, closing a whole range of tax shelters, investing more as part of the infrastructure investment in environmental protection, strengthening worker rights and worker benefits. Look, on the infrastructure, Charlie, you've probably heard me say this before. If a moment when we can borrow money at 1.7% for 10 years in a currency we print ourselves, if that is not the moment to invest in making LaGuardia Airport look like it should, I don't know when that moment will ever come. And there are lots of examples. Let me give you one. Let me just give you one other because it really struck me. I've been using that example about Kennedy and LaGuardia Airport for a while. And eventually, the guy from the Port Authority who's in charge called me, and he discussed the plans they had to fix it and so forth. But then he said something that was right. He said, the real outrage is the air traffic control system. We in the United States have an air traffic control system that's based on vacuum tubes, like the old-fashioned television sets. And as a consequence, it doesn't have enough capacity for all the flights. And so sometimes they use yellow stickies to keep track of all the flights. Apart from the fact that it doesn't make me feel so safe, and I suspect it doesn't make you feel so safe, it means that less flights can fly. Yeah. It means there's more circling the airport, which wastes energy. And eventually we're going to run, they're not training any new 25-year-olds who can fix vacuum tube technologies. So eventually the people who know how to make this work are going to retire and move on. So we've got a lot of fundamental infrastructure investments that we need to make, and making them is a major source of middle-class jobs. Yeah. And so this is something that increases demand, that puts people to work, that increases the supply potential of the economy, and finally, that takes a big burden off our children. Because this idea that when we borrow money, that's burdening our children, but that if we defer maintenance and allow the government to run down, that's just good public policy, that doesn't really make any sense. Deferring maintenance is just as much a burden on our children. It's repressing a deficit, and it's just as much a burden on our children as borrowing money.
Get to these 2 points. What's the consequence of not doing something about income inequality?
You know, if you look at the public opinion polls, Charlie, you find that confidence in almost every institution has gone way down.
Sure.
And I think that at its root, that's because most people see that their incomes aren't going up very fast, if at all, that they don't have confidence that their children are going to live better lives than they did, and that they are able to see that a very small group seems to be getting a very large fraction of the economic growth.
Which breeds a sense of unfairness, which therefore creates social tension and
resentment, unfairness, lack of confidence in institutions. And I think we get caught in a cycle that's really very problematic, which is people lose confidence in government and business. Because they lose confidence in government and business, they make it much harder for government and business to do anything. Right. Then when they don't do anything, they lose more confidence in them, and the whole thing cycles. So here's another way of thinking about it. John Kennedy in 1960 was able to famously ask people, ask not what you can do, what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. But that was after the country had delivered 3% a year increase in living standards since the Second World War. That was after the interstate highway system had been built. That was after the FHA had created the suburbs. That was after the GI Bill had sent a generation to work. And so the government could call on its citizens because the country had delivered for its middle class. If the country doesn't deliver for its middle class, it becomes much harder for it to call on its middle class, whether it's to protect the environment, whether it's in response to a national security concern, whether it's to look out for the poor, which is obviously a continuing issue for us. It degrades ultimately the character of our democracy, because at least my conviction has always been, and I think the difficulties that Latin America has had in particular illustrate this, that in Abe Lincoln's famous phrase, democracy doesn't just mean government by the people, it has to mean government for the people. And the way people judge that is by what's happening to them in their ordinary lives. And when they don't feel like they're being protected from large forces, that's when they become disillusioned. So I don't think there's any more important issue.